As a product person, how do you balance experimentation and hypothesis testing with, avoiding feature bloat?
At some level, you're saying if you're going to experiment and see what works, that means by definition, you're determining what doesn't work. And I think that's part of the problem is instead of that happening, folks are saying, oh, we can do another thing. We can do another thing. Or what's the next thing? Back to that part of the conversation that we were having. And to me, this always kind of ends in the consideration of when are you learning?
Hello, everyone. My name is Rob Ocel, VP of Innovation at This.Labs, here for another episode of the Leadership Exchange. Today, I'm here with Jason Williams. Jason is the Chief Product and Technology Officer at HealthJoy. Jason, how are you doing?
I am doing great, and it is really glad to be here. Thanks for the invite. Really looking forward to digging in.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have this conversation because you and I have had the opportunity to both meet and be on some panels in the healthcare space down in Atlanta, and it's great to bring you onto the podcast and share the amazing conversations with everybody else as well. So thanks so much for agreeing to be a part of this. I think, I introduced you as the
There was
chief.
no pulling my arm on this one, man. I would talk about this stuff, for many hours a day if that's all I had to do.
Hey, that's why we do the podcast. I mean, I think, sometimes people love to talk. They just think, people don't necessarily, who would want to listen to this? I mean, great wisdom from people with years of experience. I think a lot of people would. Listen, I introduced you as the Chief Product and Technology Officer. I know that you've had kind of a long career with different companies, working in product, and you have some great thoughts on kind of what it takes to be a good product leader, a good product manager. So I thought maybe to start us off, give us your thoughts on some of the things, I guess, that make people become great product managers.
Yeah, it's always a great question. It's a question I get a lot from folks in my team, from folks out in industry, just from a general mentoring perspective. And one of the things that I've seen over time, partly through making bad hires at different times, is that there's kind of a distribution of product people, and there's an end that you hope you've never hired. There's kind of where a lot of them tend to fall, and that tends to feel more like project management than it does like product leadership. And I think that's one of the biggest differences to me is, I view, a good product person, they're leading in a number of ways. And the difference in that and the project-oriented person, for example, is, you hear a lot in product and technology delivery about releases and the quality of releases or continuous delivery of releases. And when I hear that too much, and I haven't heard people talk about the results, a good product person is not just talking about managing the process and getting a release cut. They're talking about what's the thesis behind what we're doing. And importantly, how do we know? So one, do we know what the problem we're trying to solve for is versus the requirements that we struck? And if we know what the problem is, after we go about this release, how do we know if we're solving it? Is there some number? Is there some feedback loop that we need to create to know that we're solving it? And related to that, that the release doesn't end at the release. If they're not thinking about, you don't often solve a problem fantastically at the MVP, which is why they talk about MVPs, right? It's minimum viability, not maximum utility, so to speak. And so if you're not chasing after continuing to learn and iterate at some level, you want to learn a lot before the release, but nobody should expect that you're done. And too many product people are concerned with ticking to the next thing. And you hear this in a lot of companies, like, oh, they just walked away from that and started doing something else, and that's not good enough. Well, maybe it was good enough to start with, but if you're not thinking that it has to have some progression and there's some additional learning to do, those are a couple of limitations I would start with.
Do you think that idea that sometimes product people will walk away from something afterwards, do you think that is driven by sort of issues of the training of product people, or do you think that's a cultural thing? Some of the things that I've suspected and the conversations I've had is that too many companies, again, you get what you measure, too many companies reward the cool new thing that generates marketing buzz, that gets some people to sign on, but maintaining or enhancing the features that are already there, like that's not something that is celebrated enough. And so why would a product manager want to stay on and see something through several cycles of maturity if they got 90% of the reward and acknowledgement from launching it? Of course, they're just going to go launch something else, right?
Yeah, but what happens is later on down the road when you're not retaining the client, per se, because you missed or you didn't actually get to where you needed to go. That's I think the important difference, and I've seen this a ton, right? You're out there in the market, you're participating in a competitive set, and maybe you sell a little bit, and you sell on promise, you retain on proof. And
Hmm.
the promise of the release, a lot of times you can make some hay around that, but over the annual retention for your recurring revenue or what have you that might be associated to that, if you're not really nailing it, and there may be some cases where you nailed it enough that it's a waste of your time to continue and double down resource there. But where there's more ambiguity in what you're entering, more often than not, you probably didn't. And if you didn't, part of the plan, and I think part of the answer to your question is if the expectation hasn't been set early on, that's where a better product person knows to set these expectations. Hey, you gave me this capacity to go and get to a release. I need a couple of follow-on blocks. I don't even know what I might use them for, but if we don't budget that time so that I don't have to jump into the next thing because we were so strict to the roadmap and there was no time for learning and iterative follow-up releases, well, then I've designed myself into a corner, and that's all
Hmm.
you're going to get because I have to move to the next things because that's how we've say better set our budget, for example. So
Yeah.
that sort of thinking and that sort of leadership into the process is again, I think the difference in the person who's just trying to manage getting done with the process and the one that really understands the dynamics of why are we making the investment in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And it's funny too because like I think features and products elements of products have different purposes. Some things are those things that are meant to look good through the window that get someone to come in, and others are there to deepen the experience of your core users. And I think, one of the challenges that we're facing right now and the temptations that we face right now in this environment with so much AI hype is that oftentimes people are building features. Well, I'll be honest, sometimes they're building features that apply to nobody or appeal to nobody, but sometimes they're there to be attractive and marketable to new people, while core users kind of look at it and go, I have had several negative experiences I've been waiting for you to address, and now you add this frilly thing that nobody wants. I'm thinking here of LinkedIn, which is a product that I do love, and the people there work very hard. But it was like, did I need AI recommendations below every post versus the usability concerns that have stayed for years? And I think that is got to be. I mean, your thoughts on this and kind of how this is a challenge for product people.
It's an interest. I'm glad you said it and I didn't. 'Cause- so now it's out in the open. As soon as you said LinkedIn, that's the first thing I thought was, they added the feature and it's topical. There's all the AI, and a lot of companies have struck a lot of bandwidth after saying, "Oh, look, we just did an AI thing." And not only did you not address something else that maybe you should have, but a lot of this is, you've got a hammer and you're trying to nail everything with it with generative AI capability now. And I think number one, again, you should be smarter than that. And a good product person, they know the difference. Is this use case? First question you should ask about any new technology is what is it bad at? Because I think a lot of those situations you're talking about is someone aimed it at something that either doesn't really have a user value proposition or it's just not acutely good at it. And they did it to kind of check the box because that's what everybody's trying to do now. And another thing I think that's related to that is there's a product-led growth concept that I'm sure you're familiar with. But for anyone that's not, it's essentially, how do you avoid kind of burying the lead? And a lot of feature creep, it can bury the lead to what do I really want? And I had a conversation with one of my teams about this not long ago because I told them, hey, we're presenting people a lot of things they potentially can do. And the PLG concept is don't give them so much. Find the shortest path to let them do something useful immediately, and the uptick that you're going to get because the first time user experience supported them doing something useful is phenomenal. I think one of the events that you and I were at, I talked about the bathroom door example I use with the teams sometimes, and to me it's an example of feature creep because a lot of times it's fascinating to me. You go into a restroom and on the way out, maybe they put the trash can by the door that you can throw the towel in that you use to grab the handle. Or maybe there's these elbow hooks or foot hooks. And there's all these things that are designed to be different approaches to you don't want to touch the door. And I ask people, they're like, okay, why are you telling me about this? Well, go to the airport. What do you notice about the door?
That there isn't one.
There's no door.
Yeah.
They made the experience. Let's not try to build around different ways to address your concern. The core concern we haven't removed. And when you say this to product people, they'll immediately start to map, oh, where are the doors that we've put into our experience that shouldn't be there and that we've tried to kind of engineer around, but the core root cause of it, we haven't really addressed.
That's right. Yeah. It's like that. There's that other meme too, right? Where it's like the gate that's like got all the locks on it and stuff like that, but there's no fence. And then there's just tire tracks that go around it on both sides. That type of idea.
Exactly. Right.
But so how do you balance experimentation and hypothesis testing with feature creep? A conversation that I hadn't really thought too much about, but it's like open up Twitter or X these days and look at how many do it in the web version and look at how many options there now are on the sidebar of different things. I mean, between the Grok AI and communities and products and marketplaces and on some level, that's the design of the app. It's trying to be everything for everyone. But some
Hmm.
people are now starting to say, like, listen, it is now so bloated, I can't do efficiently the things I want to do. There are just too many things. So at the same time, somebody said, I love that. That's a great way to lead a product because you just do a bunch of stuff and you see what sticks. And I thought, well, that's an interesting hypothesis there. But I think there is a concern with this bloat. So where do you, as a product person, how do you balance experimentation and hypothesis testing with, avoiding feature bloat?
One of the things that you're making me think of, this is a question that we had not long ago about, um, I think someone tried to set it as killing your puppies because there's another way that that's been said. It sounds even less palatable than the puppies. At some level, you're saying if you're going to experiment, see what works, that means by definition, you're determining what doesn't work. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's part of the problem is instead of that happening, folks are saying, oh, we can do another thing. We can do another thing. Or what's the next thing? Back to that part of the conversation that we were having. And to me, this always kind of ends in the consideration of when are you learning? Because there's certain things you should absolutely learn before you go to a market release, and how you go about that can maybe avoids the 8 of the 10 typical questions or gaps that you would hear from the market because you did the right discovery and you put up some prototypes and maybe they're no code. Maybe it's just Figma designs that you put in front of someone to get a sense for feedback. You may not go to code at all, or maybe what you code might bring into account some things that you didn't really realize that everybody would tell you after you go out there and try to start selling the thing. So I think one, what is your experimentation, oriented around? And if it's not partly oriented around making the decision of experimentation says what works, what doesn't, we decide what doesn't, either in new product development or with some of the stuff that's already out there. That's the after delivery learning is what you're talking about. Now
Yeah.
you've created the bloat and maybe it didn't feel like it was bloating along the way, but now that it's there, are you learning post release from that as well? That's also giving you input signals that you maybe don't have to build anything new at all. Maybe you need to consolidate or synthesize some of what's there, might be your most valuable investment.
That's interesting. And I guess this is also why people will do beta tests or limited release type things where you sort of roll it out to small sets of people to get information that can either be elective or non elective. Um, and that made me think, again, there's this mantra that people are like, well, why do that? Just do it live. Just iterate quickly, go quickly, right? Move fast and break things. That's always been the mantra. And I want to believe though that it's not that easy. It is in code, right? You put the code in, you can revert the code back out. It's back to the way it was. But I feel like we can sometimes take advantage or overestimate the degree to which customers are resilient in the face of change. I think they are to a point, but once you hit an inflection point, you see things run away from you, and there's not an easy way to just go back. Like there is something lost if you run a bunch of experiments, you bloat the product, you release things that you didn't want to release, even if you take them back and then head down the right path. Like it still feels like there was something that was changed. Like, do you agree with this premise, or what are your thoughts on kind of the effects that releases and products have on customers, even if they are later retracted or edited or changed?
Well, I think you got to know your customer, Rob. And I think that my answer to your question is different in different scenarios. Because, like for me,
Mm.
I've been in B2B and B2B2C, for example, and the C's are more tolerant of that. One, because they may be more occasional users, and when they see something interesting, they'll try it, they forget. I think there's a little bit more forgiveness in some of that consumer digital experimentation. But when it comes to business and enterprise, you go talk to your account management team about making that subtle change that they're going to take the 56 calls about. So I think a lot of it is it's not solving the you problem that you want to experiment and do things and be cool and potentially create opportunities, but you're doing this to some group of users or organizational entities. And if the expectation is, and I've had this happen where in an environment they said, hey, you guys aren't moving fast enough, and that's because of the speed that the business problems and their jobs to be done were moving. In that environment, that was almost expected, and where you're not meeting with it, like, hey, come on. In other environments, the risk that you create in potentially breaking, an experience that they've trained a department on for the year, and causing some amount of downstream effect is great. And they don't want to see you doing certain things that they believe are going to interject risk or some other negative outcomes
Yeah.
without a bit more advanced either planning or expectation setting or that sort of thing.
Well, and they also say too, right? Like I said, people are only as mad until your next big win, right? I mean, this like, winning kind of cures all. If you can release that new feature that everybody asked for, everybody's happy. And I agree to a point, it can fix most of the damage, but I think there is scar tissue that builds up in a
Mhm.
customer base with respect to a product. And eventually you will lose those customers. I mean, I look at the example of Twitter. I mean, I'm not saying Twitter's dying, but I have seen now significantly more communities fracture off to Blue Sky or Threads or, whatever else because enough scar tissue finally built up that the group just reached a point, no matter how many cool new features came out, no matter how much that's where there were more people, they just finally said, no, enough is enough. And it broke off. And I think that is maybe something that not enough companies and people who manage products are considering. It's just like, we think about it with tech, like what is our tech debt? But there's almost like, what is our goodwill debt? Like what is our scar tissue that is accumulated in our product? Where are we and what do we need to do to kind of work around that? It's maybe not a conversation that's happening enough right now.
Yeah, the Twitter X example, you bring in other inflictions of the wounds that cause some of those scars that I
Yeah.
won't talk about. But I think it is important. And again, again, knowing your customer not just from a technical needs standpoint, but understanding what are they what's the interior of the problem that they're trying to solve, or they feel you're trying to solve for them, and knowing when what you trying to do, what you want to do, seems to be departing from that. And that's, I think, what flips over more into the product leadership side of things, because you don't necessarily expect that to come from a product person. They may be working on one piece of overall what you're trying to accomplish, and they collectively can contribute to the bloat that you're talking about
Hmm.
if you don't have the right level of leadership that's recognizing how not just the technology and the brand, but what the expectations of the people that you're serving are meeting with the aggregate of what you're putting in front of them.
Great. Well, we have more of this conversation, but first, we'd like to thank today's sponsor. This episode is brought to you by This.Labs, the experts in modern web development and consulting. If you're looking to scale up your development teams efficiently, or you need assistance in turning your innovative ideas into reality with some robust proofs of concept, This.Labs has you covered. This.Labs doesn't just build software, they also build partnerships. They collaborate closely with your team to understand your unique challenges, and they craft tailored solutions that drive real results. You can join the many companies that have accelerated their growth and innovation with the help of This.Labs by visiting this.co to discover how they can help you take your projects to the next level. Thanks to This.Labs and my team for sponsoring this episode and supporting the developer community, the leadership community, and allowing me to have these kind of cool conversations. All right, back to our conversation. So, Jason, another thing that you say is a big part of sort of product development and product leadership is this idea of the ability to motivate. And I mean, maybe that's self evident, but I kind of want you to first introduce this idea on why maybe, even though it might seem obvious, it's still important and be a difficult skill for some people to exercise.
Yeah, I think organizations they over rotate on the execution, and I have this personal belief about intellectual property that we create in tech, that those are separate. You have intellectuals and you have property, and there is the literal IP that we build on, but it's built through, this is knowledge work. This is about the people that deploy it. And I think one of the important things about that to me is culture, but I can come back to that. Um, the sense that the people that you have trying to deploy the technology and the attachment that they have to the context that they're deploying it in, what that turns into for me, Rob, is, I was just telling my team this beforehand. I don't want them waiting for me, and they wait for you when they don't understand more than, hey, I'm working on this release, I have this feature, I have this milestone, And I think there's something that matters about a date that's coming up, and maybe we should be thinking about tinkering with the scope, or I don't know, maybe do we not? And what's most important is what's most important the context of solving the problem for the user, and if we got to reset expectations, around the date to make sure that that's what we're doing, as opposed to cutting it down and saying we met the date and we got there, then we don't have the right contextual motivation where they don't feel kind of stuck in, hey, I don't know, so I'm just going to do what I think is the low risk thing that I'm not necessarily comfortable with, or that I don't necessarily feel proud of my output as a consequence, because you haven't given them enough to operate in that environment in a way that they're motivated by what it is they're trying to achieve, but they're also empowered by the understanding of the context and maybe the bumpers that you put around them, so they feel like they can navigate on their own without having to wait for me or leadership for these kind of constant interventions, or feeling like we haven't intervened and helped them because we didn't give them enough at the outset.
That's really interesting take on that. Can you go into that a little bit deeper? Because what I heard is that motivation is not just the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It's not just the really cool utopia we're working towards, but it's also the set of intermediate signposts that you can understand and believe in. You understand how to get to that pot of gold. You understand how to get to that motivating factor, so that at any given point you just can kind of scan around and look for the signposts, follow the constellation to get to where you're going. Is that accurate of what you're saying?
I think so. So let me try this on you. Tech professionals, any professionals, they don't want to be order takers. They
Right.
they they want to be, especially in tech, they want to be builders. And by order taking, if what you've given them is, hey, I have a great vision and I need you to go do this, that's not acutely motivating, right?
Yeah.
If I have a great vision and here's kind of the block and tackling framework of what that means, and you own a domain, and this is kind of the quadrant that we need to move against,
Yeah.
that's fantastically motivating, because I know I'm assigned enough. There's my quadrant that I'm acting in, and I know that overall the circle. I get it. Back to your point earlier on some of the big brands. They know kind of ethereally what the value proposition is, but they don't operate the circle. They operate their segment or whatever piece of it. So if they understand that, but that they can operate within that segment, knowing that they've got enough kind of guardrails around the kind of milestones that we create to know that they're not peeling away from fundamentally what needs to be done. So they've got degrees of freedom, but that it does tack back to making sure that we're not missing on the expectations for what you're operating in your lane.
I love that. Okay, so there's like a motivation at both the local level, like I want to be motivated by being empowered, by being able to be effective at my job, as well as understand the thing that I do, what are its impacts going to be, and those things be intrinsically motivating. I mean, it's funny because like I have found motivation in my career. I find it exciting to solve problems, any problems. Like it is cool when you work for somebody or a company or a product that is making tremendous impacts, either in the volume of what it does or the number of people it affects or the profound way in which it affects people. But I don't know. I found it also interesting to work for companies that make like safety flip books. It's just every situation, every product has an interesting case that it has to be used in. And I guess there's like a little bit of a magic to get people excited about that. So for somebody that might say to you, hey, listen, you work in healthcare. It's got to be so easy to just show somebody a video of somebody whose health was affected by your product. That's got to be the most easy to motivate industry ever. But I'm here and I'm making widgets, and it's very difficult to get people excited about widgets that are a replacement part for a harness for a something, something, something. So like, what are your thoughts on people that say like, oh, it's easy in some industries to motivate people versus other ones?
Um, it's a good point, and I've heard this, and my own personal prayer is to be able to deploy my own whatever gifted competency that I have in some area that is helping drive some utility in folks' lives and at some level. I think number one, that almost everything that anybody does, as long as you're serving an organization that has people, can somehow be mapped. And if you're not doing the mapping, well, then shame on the leadership team. I think number one. Number two, I think even if you're doing that, and if you're in a space where that feels like it's intrinsic, you're missing the point if you think that that kind of branding level is substituting for what's happening on a day-to-day basis at the level of the team member, unit level team member doing work. I remember one of my customers at one point, and they were working in a hospital. So even closer to ground as far as how you move and motivate people. They said, Jason, I go out and I walk the floor, to some of my teams that are taking, case management calls, for example, and I find out all the time that what's happening out there isn't what I would have assumed was happening, and that they're as happy and joyous about the environment that they're doing the work in because I'm not close enough to the work. And when it comes to technology delivery, when you get closer to the work, and people are getting the pressures around managing tech debt. I have to adjust scope. We're at risk of this. We ran into the unanticipated incident in parallel, and I have to go deal with that. That on the ground, everything's not as easy as kind of the high level, kind of purposeful vision, mission segment that you're supporting. And so to make people feel motivated truly in any environment, I think you can't disconnect that way up here we have what sounds great on the website, and that's not what people are working through on a day-to-day basis.
I think too that stories play a lot here, and I think you have to culturally become a culture of storytellers. I used to work for government consulting, and at the time it was defense contracting, so it was systems that were being actively deployed on battlefields, and so
Mm,
sometimes you would hear stories from the people that were doing it, and yes, of course, what's on the website says we save lives, right? But
mhm.
what was personally motivating was being able to hear a story of how it saved a life, because those became the stories you told the team. Like that became where you reached for if you sort of lost your path, and you were like, that story is so moving, that story is so profound, and we tell that story a lot because it recrystallizes it down. Your thoughts on like becoming a culture of storytellers. Does that get through this, or do you still need more?
I personally am a storyteller. And I think for me, the high level stories, even the company stories, the company videos, they're great, they're helpful. For me, though, I feel like it's a failure of leadership not to make that more personal. Kind of pulling things off the company shelf is one thing, but my prior role, I used to ask my team, when's the last time you asked, say, your FedEx driver, because FedEx was one of our customers, and they show up on your porch with packages, and they knew they were a customer because they were a big one. But when's the last time you asked somebody that showed up, because that's your user? And I said, I've asked them, and what do you hear that they say? There's another example. More recently, I was in the airline club on the way to a meeting, and I had to help a gentleman off of the toilet,
Hmm.
which was an
Hmm.
interesting thing. He had called out for some assistance, and people kind of ignored him. And I'm like, well, that's not cool. So I actually kind of helped him to stand up. And we actually do have a solution we refer to people for to help with their mobility after they've had the kind of procedures that he had described to me, which gave him some difficulty with his personal mobility. But guess what? One, as a leader of an organization that's supposed to be doing that, am I recognizing those opportunities with the FedEx driver or with the person that you encounter that does what you do? Because when my team sees that they know I believe it. They know I'm not pulling it off the shelf if I'm recognizing the opportunities that I personally have to attach to it, and I'm sharing those with them. And then they're going to go and do likewise.
I really like that call out too, because it does speak to this idea that there is no story or impact that actually is too small to be motivating. I was I thought about this somewhat recently in that I used to live in Washington D.C. As I said, I used to do a lot of government contracting, and there used to be a guy who had a food truck, a food cart outside of our office. And it was halal food, and it was amazing. It was phenomenal. He cooked it at home and then brought it in, and it was amazing. And this guy got to know you over the course of years of hanging out with him. He'd ask you about your family, he'd recognize you. We moved away. A year later, we visited him again, and he recognized us in the line. He said, "You're back. How has everything been? You moved away."
Awesome.
I mean, what an amazing story. But here's where the story I think gets quite profound. 10 years then pass, and we take our son for the first time to DC, and I say we should check to see if he's still there. So we went to the spot, and he wasn't. But here's the thing. We found it online, that he had actually just passed away months before. But
Oh.
on social media where this was posted, I mean, the outpouring of
Mm.
people that were saying how much this guy meant to him, and also the fact that we were there a decade later because
Wow.
of the impact he had on us, and all he was doing was serving us lunch. And I think that like people sometimes underestimate significantly the impact that small choices can have on what you do in the world. And like again, just asking people how their day is going as they're ordering from your food truck creates a relationship where I carry the memory of this guy with me, after he's passed. And like, how cool must that be for his family who might not have realized the impact that he had on people?
That's tremendous. It's a great story, and it reminds me of another one. Years ago, we were implementing software, electronic medical record systems into hospitals, and usually they like to do that in less busy times. So we're on the weekend, we're in the middle of the night, and everybody's running around doing technical tasks and end user testing and all that. And someone came to us as we started to bring things up and said, "Hey, there were twin babies, and one went to neo ICU and one went to healthy baby, and it looked like their orders were going to get switched." Ooh, man, you know, you don't want to have a your system kills babies kind of kind of thing come out of that. So we went into overdrive and we're checking logs and doing all kinds of stuff to figure out that it wasn't in fact a system issue that was at play in this. Whew, thank goodness. But the CFO then invites me up he says, "Hey, you want to go see the NICU?" And they're a baby factory in this particular hospital, so their neo ICU was enormous. And I got to go up there with him and see little baby B. That was actually the fault in this whole scenario, is when twins are born, there's often this baby A, baby B kind of identifier thing that can throw people off. But I got to see little baby B in her tiny little box, in the palm of your hand size, and get a sense for all the technical running around that we just did was in service of keeping baby B and all of her cohort safe. And what I recognized at that moment, which kind of goes to what I was saying earlier, is a lot of people in any domain, what they do is far enough back. What my developers, what the operators that were running the jobs, they're never going to be in the NICU necessarily with baby B. And so they can lose context for the importance of the work that they're doing, whatever lane that is. And it doesn't have to be healthcare. It can be something that's services oriented, something that's helping people on the manufacturing line, understanding that context when people aren't sitting in the context all the time can phenomenally change the way that they take on their jobs. And I think I look at it not just as an opportunity. I feel like it's a failure of leadership to not give them that. Because it happens in more domains than I can think of that you would presume that it's inherently motivating.
I love that, right? Seeing how your product affects one person can be more motivating than hearing how it affected hundreds of thousands of people.
That's
Like
right.
you can
Because
hear it was
especially when it's
profoundly impactful for millions, but seeing it impact one can be a more potent lesson for you, or a more
100%.
motivator for you. Yeah.
Those people who were up all night working on that hospital in that situation, that probably changed their lives. And they're probably still telling that story to this day.
And
Um,
there you go. And that's how culture breeds, a culture of storytellers who motivate other people by what motivated them. That's really cool. Well, hey,
100%.
this has been a great conversation, but very quickly we find ourselves at the end. For people that are interested in maybe keeping this conversation going with you or connecting with you online, can you let people know where they can find you?
Certainly. So Jason Williams on LinkedIn, LinkedIn / J Williams 2004. That was my grad school year. J Williams 2004 is the easiest way. Always happy to engage the conversation. Just at a level of anything certainly I can be helpful with, or just to entertain the dialogue. Love to talk about this stuff and just kind of iron sharpens iron, so to speak, for people who are practitioners, or I've had fun conversations with people who are thinking about coming into the space.
Wonderful. Well, that is going to be it for us today. Thanks, of course, to Jason for being our guest, and thanks to each of you for listening. Hope to see you all next time. As we close out, we'd just like to thank today's sponsor, This.Labs, one last time, who would like me to remind you that sometimes it's hard to bridge the gap between business objectives and tech implementation, and it can get messy. This is trusted by top names like Meta, Google, and T-Mobile, and they love helping business leaders fulfill their strategic digital initiatives. Check them out at this.co. One more time, that's THISDOT.co. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.